making it through the week, the first week, getting back what's going on and get accustomed to what we're doing here. So this morning, we have Public Transportation Electrification Plan. Ross McDonald's with us. And so with any further ado, let's turn. Is Ross with us this morning?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning. Good morning. So it's all yours. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Ross McDonald. I'm the Public Transit Program Manager at VTrans. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if I may. And if you could just let me know when you see this, that would be great.
There we go. We see it.
Okay. Well, great. So last year, the T-bill in Section 35 included a provision for us to develop a electrification plan. That plan has been called the VTrans Zero Emissions Transition Plan, and it is a requirement with the new low and no emissions bus applications that we apply for each year. As you can see here to the right, these are the memos or the chapters of the plan that is in draft form now, due to be published at the end of this month. And this isn't the start of our electrification efforts. I want to just point out that we have secured funding for 18 vehicles over 5 low and no emission grants from FTA, as well as 2 buses from the VW settlement program. We only have 2 on the road at this point. 5 are being delivered this week or within a few months. And 6 of our 7 providers have embarked upon the electrification process with 2 to 4 or 5 vehicles to really start understanding what it takes to electrify our fleets. The goals were really broad brushed over the next 20, 30 years. How could we fully electrify the fleet? What are the challenges, the benefits, the components for us to consider? For this study, we convened a technical advisory committee with members from Department of Public Service, A&R, VTrans environmental staff, and our electric bus consultant VEIC. We each reviewed the chapters and contributed feedback throughout. And concurrent to that, my staff and myself have been part of industry webinars, conferences, to be sure the electrification process and industry is getting a lot of attention in the public transit space. What we're learning is that it's more complex than buying the vehicles and the chargers. But we also found enough positive aspects and potential to justify furthering these electrification efforts that are already underway. When we look at a national perspective, there's only 2,700 vehicles that are zero emission buses, and of that, only 87 of those vehicles are hydrogen. Most are electric vehicles out on the road now. We're seeing 24% increases from one year to the next, and expect that to increase with the robust funding that the low and no emissions bus program is going to have under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Of the 80,000 transit buses, 3.5% are zero emissions. If we look at our own fleet size of 425 vehicles, 18 vehicles, that's just about 3.5%. That's a lot for a rural state. I think of Maine and New Hampshire, who haven't procured any electric buses to date. We know that 29% carbon emissions in the U.S. are from transportation, over 40% in this state. And that we are seeing a lot of advances in the battery technology that's allowing us to consider more. The primary benefits and challenges, as you see, are what we can all understand easily and been thinking about. One thing is these are quieter vehicles, less vibration. It's a rider amenity, and the ones that are on the road in Burlington are regularly receiving high praise from the riders.
What's the now that we have a couple of them operating, what's the range or hour, or how do they operate? I know they're going to get better as the years go on, but presently the ones that we have, what do they go? 2 hours or 50 miles or?
Well, it depends on the vehicle size, and the Proteras that are on the road right now are about 170 miles, operating for 8 to 10 hours. We're able to use those vehicles on over 80% of the current GMT routes without any operational issues. To date, the issues have been with keeping them on the road due to electrical issues, not with the drivetrain, but with the doors, with the charging equipment, with some of the maintenance items. But I'm happy to say that after some fits and starts, those buses are up and running and are on the road as much as the rest of the fleet.
You're not going to have any mechanical or major mechanical issues. It's a whole new system, right? It just, you're talking about batteries, and as far as mechanical, there's very little maintenance, I guess.
Right, and that's interesting to note that 75% of the bus is the same from electric to diesel, but it's that drivetrain, the lube oil filters maintenance isn't going to be required the way it is now. The high cost of gas isn't part of the equation. This plan doesn't look at operational pickups and efficiencies through the life cycle of the bus. We're really looking at the capital replacement and investments to put the buses on the road. We do expect to see significant savings in maintenance with these buses once we get up and running.
Can they go all day long on a route without getting recharged right now?
Some of the larger buses can. When we look at the cutaways, which make up 60% of our fleet in the state, they're only about 4 or 5 hours, 100 miles or so. And when we look at this plan, we'll be seeing that each provider gave us routes and the amount of time that those buses need to stay on the road, miles and hours, and that we actually assess current specs and which routes could accommodate an electric bus now, which would require better technology, better operational specs. That's coming up a little bit later in these slides. But we're going to need better operational specifications and range. But right now, as you'll see, we have over 80% of our routes that could be served right now with the larger buses, and over 50% of the routes of right now could be served with our cutaways.
Can I ask a question, Chair?
Sure, go right ahead, jump right in. Yep.
Ross, great to see you again. So I don't know if you know the answer to this, but on your previous slide, you said there's about 2,700 electric buses in adoption. My apologies. In adoption right now. Do you have any sense if we are an outlier in our colder climate? Are these being more predominantly or more common in the warmer areas? I know when we originally got these, we were worried about the really cold January, February months, as well as the salt on the roads. Any comments on that?
Yes, nice to see you too, Senator. It's true that the overwhelming majority of these 2,700 buses are in warm temperatures. I think 35% of that 2,700 are in California right now. So one of the elements that we need to consider, and we'll talk a little bit about needing those auxiliary diesel heaters. The range is reduced when we're on those hilly terrains that we're facing. Those are taken into account. And that's why these initial 18 buses are going to go a long way in informing our future plans, because nothing beats on the road case studies in the specific areas and on the specific routes that they need to be on. These buses need to be charged, of course, and we're expecting the corded plug-in to the left as being the overwhelming majority for charging these vehicles. As you can see, there's overhead conductive charging, pantographs, those types of things. But right-of-ways and infrastructure costs, and as we talk about these specs, we're thinking that maybe in the GMT urban area where you have buses sharing a lot of routes, you have a downtown transit center, that could be an area to consider overhead conductive charging, en route charging. Wireless inductive charging, that's an interesting concept. If you look at the cons down below, it's not offered as a standard option by any North American bus manufacturer. This is what we're seeing, is that there's so much development in such a dynamic industry that as we look at a moment in time, it's due to change almost immediately upon publication.
Ross, I have a
Yes.
question. I'm actually 2 slides back. And with reference to the hydrogen fuel cell buses, we've had kind of a flurry of email around hydrogen fuel as opposed to battery powered. What is the experience with the hydrogen fuel cell buses? And is there thinking about, is that an emerging technology? Are there advantages? I know that there are probably disadvantages as well, but what does the experience tell us so far? Is that
Sure.
something that is under consideration?
The hydrogen buses benefits are that they
Hello?
operate very similar to a internal combustion engine or ICE engine. And you'll see that acronym later. Some of the cons or challenges are that many times it takes a lot of energy to produce the hydrogen, and then you have to transport the hydrogen over the road. I had a visitor over the holidays who's working on hydrogen projects in New Jersey, where they're hoping to plug into pipelines from Texas and use offshore wind to produce clean hydrogen, having shared sites for New Jersey Transit and those types of scale. In Vermont, we lack that infrastructure to readily switch over to hydrogen. It is something that we, in the recommendations, are asked to consider concurrent to our electrification efforts. But at this point, we're not gaining a lot of traction. We're seeing a viable way forward in just public transit vehicles for hydrogen. It would take a much larger scale of shared depots and services, but it's not something we're not familiar with, but it is something that we haven't been able to really envision in this state right now.
Thanks.
Sure. So here we are. We have 123 routes. They mentioned GTFS, that's General Transit Feed Specifications, which are used to identify the length and the time schedules and the like. GMT has 60 of those 123 routes. They have about 50% of our ridership, 50% of our vehicles. It's a pretty easy way to look at the state, is GMT is about half, and then we have our 6 other providers throughout our more rural areas. We also have 700,000 additional trips that are made through our demand response services, which are in addition to these 123 routes. When we talk about the providers, really the outreach to them was just trying to figure out where these providers are in terms of support for these electrification plans and efforts, and overwhelmingly they get it. They understand the value, the better operational pickups. And certainly we know that diesel buses need about 15 people plus on them to mitigate the pollution from that diesel compared to if everybody drove their own vehicles. And so if we electrify, then we know that we're part of our greenhouse gas reduction profile. We also looked at all of these energy considerations, if they have electrification plans, where they have for charging opportunities, their configurations, on-site solar and the like. Those are just really trying to get statewide infrastructure and capacity perspectives. And I've got a lot of slides here, so I'm going to move through a little bit. But charging is a big component. And just to mention that we do have space in most of our facilities to accommodate the charging infrastructure. We know that many of these facilities would have to prepare for a much larger electrification, electric bill, and electric capacity at their facilities. 5 of the 7 facilities would require fit ups in partnership with the utility to be able to deal with that nightly load. Charging during off-peak times, we know that's critical. As I attend conferences and webinars, one of the largest challenges has been the need to charge during peak hours, whether it's due to maintenance because of different charging issues throughout the night. And when that happens, the cost benefit analysis suffers greatly. So, how do we work with these utilities and continue to expand the programs that we have in place? We have folks who provide incentives to the provider. We have technical assistance. We have some infrastructure assistance on other low and no projects that are already underway. And VEIC has been really wonderful in helping us negotiate and coordinate those types of efforts between the public transit provider and the regional or their local utility. The route and block analysis. This is what I was talking about earlier, Senator Mazza, when we wanted to see what would it take and how many routes currently could accommodate an electric bus and switch out one diesel bus for one electric bus. And a block is just not only the route, but the deadhead miles going to and from the station, being down in between certain runs, those types of nuances. And the understanding was that we know that battery electric vehicles have a shorter operating range than diesel and gas powered vehicles. That rural areas tend to use the smaller cutaway vehicles. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the assumptions that we would be using auxiliary diesel heaters during the wintertime months, that we would use overnight depot charging, and that the vehicle sizes and battery capacities and kilowatt use per mile, those are current today standards and profiles.
I've yet to see a bus in Chittenden County that has over 3 or 4 passengers. Do they have to use big buses or can you use smaller buses? I mean, every time I see buses in Chittenden County, there's always, 3, 4 people on it. And could they use a smaller bus, or is that not possible to do?
It is possible, and that's why 60% of our vehicles are those smaller cutaways. And we are actually purchasing more vans for some of the demand response services, because you can see 1 or 2 people on those Medicaid and elderly and persons with disability trips. One of the things is if we buy a Gillig bus for 12 years that has capacity for 30 people, that can be used for peak commute times. It can be used for the for the link trips. It's no problem having a fewer people on the vehicle than seats. It's a real problem having more people than seats on the bus. That, being on US 2 commuter for so many years, when we would get on that cutaway and there was 4 people standing for 30 minutes, that wasn't helping ridership, and it just kind of is the other issue to look at. So we kind of buy the buses so that they would be able to perform for peak service and peak ridership. But we do try to right size as best we can. The other item there is these cutaways are 5-year vehicles and not 12-year vehicles. There are some comfort issues with the larger vehicles, but right now, given the current routes that we are serving, 86% of those current routes could be operated using a single electric bus on a single overnight charge. Those are the larger buses we're talking about. They've got the larger range, and the industry has more experience.
How about is there such a thing as solar energy on the roof of the buses? Is that solar panels, I should say? Is that?
Yeah, we haven't seen that as much as solar panels powering an on-site battery, or what they call distributive energy resource. So if there's an on-site or off-site solar that was powering a battery, during the day, then we could charge vehicles during the day because it would be outside of the utility peak hour. It would be stored energy on site. That's where we've seen solar being incorporated. But again, just a larger, more complex piece of the puzzle as you try to keep electrons in these vehicles. Given the cutaways, 54% of our routes have that the range and the abilities for an electric cutaway to serve the route. So right now we know that we could buy a lot of buses and put them on the road at a 1-to-1 ratio, but there's a lot of nuances there. More urban blocks than rural blocks can be served by EVs, fewer miles, less miles per hour, those types of things. And the transit buses have larger batteries and those types of considerations. The IT considerations is really just managing the charge and the approach. If we look at managing the energy use, if you can see to the right, we can plug everything in at the same time and really create load strains, or we can use these managed charging approaches to smooth that out. And that could be an advantage as we negotiate utility rates with our providers there. The IT considerations is just another big part of this electric component, which is there are many IT and technological data that come through: bus performance, maintenance capacity, the charging. We get a lot of data which should allow us to better manage some of the operations around these buses. We understand that training of the EV operators, we know that they require a different mindset, and we need to use regenerative braking. We can't do quick starts and stops. That training is provided through most of our contracts, no question. And yes, that is Lindsey Graham in the Proterra bus factory in his region. The maintenance as well.
Well, I hope he has a CDL.
I don't know if that's moving, but yeah. The battery electric buses and the internal combustion engines are around 75% the same. But you do need to maintain these. We need electricians and our maintenance staff to have electrical training for these vehicles. And of course, we need to manage the extended warranties, look at the lease options. But here's the big thing. What's it going to cost, and how long will it take for us to get to these types of full electrification? And we need to start somewhere in terms of scenarios. So one of the scenarios was, let's just purchase as many electric vehicles as we can when they reach the end of their useful life. That's how we generally turn over the fleet now. When they reach the years and the miles for their vehicle, maintenance costs start skyrocketing. We will then replace that vehicle. Scenario 2 was a little different in that we want to just kind of see what would it take to be 10% of our statewide fleet to be electric by 2025. If 50% of Green Mountain's fleet was electrified, that's about 25% of our entire fleet that could be electrified by 2026. And then what would it take, looking at that 2050 goal in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, to be 100% electric? Those assumptions included a constant fleet size, vehicle useful lives, how costs decrease over time. All of those things we know are going to change. And so this is a snapshot in time using these pretty inflexible variables. But what we're seeing is that we're looking at purchasing, and it depends on 30 buses or 20 buses, depending on large and small mix, depending on what our providers need. Also, they're assuming that depot chargers are installed when a bus is purchased. We know that, or we expect that chargers will have a larger and a longer useful life than the vehicles. So over time, that level of investment for the charging piece should wane. I've got these graphs to the right. I probably had to look at those 5 or 6 times to even understand them to an extent. The big piece there is there's a straight light blue line of just under $20 million per year, which is the average spending. Scenarios 2 is just over $16 million. And it's a little bit easier to discuss in the next slide here. The existing fleet between now and 2050 will cost about $275 million to replace all the diesel buses with diesel buses. Scenario 1 is to ramp up pretty quickly and spend another $287 million over the next 28 years to electrify. And scenario 2 allows for more ICE vehicles to be purchased concurrent and still reaching that 2050 goal. But it's about $205 extra million over the next 28 years. But
what's going to happen to the more electricity we use? Aren't the power companies going to have to charge more for electricity? I mean, when there's more demand for electricity, it's going to grow that big. What's the factor there? How does that going to work? Because certainly Green Mountain Power or any of the large companies, they got to produce more power because the demand is going to be there. So how is that going to work out?
Yeah, I don't know, Senator. And as we electrify our personal cars and our heating systems and our transit buses, this is something that is discussed quite a bit, which is how high can the utilities go in terms of producing all of those electrons on demand and as needed. That's why I think in the transit field, we can do a couple of things. That managed charging could allow us to smooth out the demand at these facilities. We could have distributive energy resources where we have on-site storage that allow for more smooth use throughout a 24-hour period. And then, of course, we can be part of the utilities emergency plans. If we are holding so much energy in our buses and in our on-site batteries that are powered by solar, could they bring in their own infrastructure and pull that energy during peak times when necessary? We may be part of the solution as well as part of the increased demand if we are able to thread the needle and negotiate the right contracts and programs with these utilities.
And Senator Mazza, I've been involved with some of those discussions about the questions that you just asked. And as of right now, their contingency plan is, and you can read it. It's not been out there very well. There's been a couple stories I've reported on it, but their contingency plan is a plan for rolling blackouts, 10% rolling blackouts when they don't have enough power, and we're close to that. We'll be close to that within 3 years. They said it's going to take 30 years to build the infrastructure that we need to supply the power that they're asking for. But as of right now, the contingency plan is to have rolling blackouts to 10% of the grid in Vermont. So that's their plan.
Where is that? Is that a report, Senator Ingalls? If the best report that you can get on that is VEPSA. VPPSA. Yeah.
And if you contact them, they'll Linneville Electric. If you contact Linneville Electric and ask them for that report, Senator Kitchell, they'll have that. And it's not just them. It's all Green Mountain Power is involved with that. Burlington Electric Department's involved with that. All of the major power companies. That's the portfolio of how they're going to deal with that as of right now. So they all have that report.
Senator Mazza.
Yes, go right ahead. Yep.
I think what Senator Ingalls is talking about is an ISO report, but that's been the contingency plan forever. Like that's always what they would do.
That's not true, Senator. That's not. It's a new plan, and
the plan is new. But what I'm saying is that anytime that there was a constraint on power, rolling blackouts is what they do, and that would have been the same before or now. we want to have a
But
discussion
they never
on,
had the load on that, Senator, to
We-
ever even discuss that and even have it be a reality, where now we're getting to the point where the plans that we're trying to put forth are greater than what the grid will be able to supply, and they will not be able to build up fast enough. And so it is starting to become a reality.
I disagree with what you're saying. I think we have different information. If we want to get into the utility issues, we can have the Department of Public Service and the utilities in, and they have been in the past,
Absolutely.
and they have said
We
that
should.
that is not the truth. You keep interrupting me, Senator Ingles.
I
I don't
apologize.
understand what system of committee discussion you are operating under.
Well, I apologize.
I think if we're going to say these statements, we should bring in the utility experts. I think what you're saying is not true. And
Okay.
it's not key to the Transportation Committee. So I don't think we need to have them in, but if we're going to make decisions about transportation policy, then I think we do need to have them in, because what they've said in the past is that the increase in the load is not of concern right now, and that it is something that we can handle. And
Okay,
one of the issues for ISO is that in the winter, when we're using natural gas for heating, that there's constraints there, and there are constraints. I'm not saying there's no issues at all, but to say that we're going to go to 10%, rolling blackouts is something that very unlikely to happen on the margins, and is not going to be because of our electrification plans.
What I'll do, Senator Perchlik, is I will, instead of calling in the anybody else, I'll get the report to the committee so that everybody will have that report, the same report that I've been involved with and the same discussions that I've been having, which differs from what you're saying. And again, I'll just get the report and share it with everybody, and then everybody can read it.
Okay, go right ahead, Ross. Yeah, Senator Chittenden.
Yeah, I'd love to see all that information. Can I go into the scenario 1 and scenario 2, Ross? So I think these are important questions, and I think you're leading us towards maybe which path you're going to go towards. I see in your assumptions constant fleet size, vehicle useful lives, cost, how cost decrease. Is there also a big assumption here about availability of these electric buses over the 10, 20-year horizon, looking at the supply chain and the increased demand across? Like, is production going to meet the expected demand for Vermont as well as the other states to electrify?
It's a real concern, Senator. And if we are seeing 12, 14, 15-month delivery times with the current demand, the low and no bus program is going to see a 10 times growth in its funding levels. So there is a real concern about the demand outstripping industry capacity to provide those vehicles. We could see 12 to 24-month delivery times. And we could also see no responses to some RFPs if people are focused on the 3,000 that Atlanta wants, or whatever that looks like. In Vermont, we'll see what that means. Low and no emission grants in the future will require a minimum. I believe it's 8 or 10 vehicles per capacity. And the industry sees this. They're ramping up as best they can. But for the next few years, and you'll see this in the first recommendation, it speaks to the concern that we may be waiting for these vehicles longer than we would for a diesel bus. So this is really, what does this mean? And I just asked AECOM to give me the total cost for ICE and for electric vehicles over the next, throughout this calculation or this modeling. And over the next 6 years, scenario 1 is looking for $149 million. And right now we spend about $8 to $10 million a year on buses. So let's say if we average $10 million with our normal budget, we would need anywhere from 13 to 15, $16 million over the next 6 years to meet either scenario 1 or scenario 2. When we look at scenario 1 and scenario 2 over the long haul, there's an average of 16 and a half or 19 million. But in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years, there's not a big difference in cost because of just ramping up to get to those goals that we talked about. What that would look like is we have our current contracts. We go out to bid for low and no vehicles at that 13 million or whatever the delta would be, and that would require additional dollars from the missing my notes here, but it's about another 1.2 to 1.8 million dollars in state and local funds, and that's not in our budget. It's not something that I'm overseeing or controlling authority in. But those are the things that we'll be talking about through this agency and with this committee as we prepare for the low and no application. Do we have the 15% match funds? And if we do, to what extent to proceed with any of this plan? Just real quick, I know we're over time, but we have another testimony coming up with my friend Dan, my staff member Dan Courier, and we can take care of that within the time that we have. So we'll be wrapping up at 10:15 regardless. But we're here at the conclusions and recommendations, and right away, that first recommendation, I didn't ask for recommendations I like. I asked for recommendations they would give us. And so I agree with some of these and are not really seeing some others. But situation is going to be dire in terms of demand and supply. They're saying that VTrain should try to order as many electric vehicles as possible, try to get in the line before more transit providers in the US develop their electrification plans. Again, you will not be able to submit an application for electric buses without a zero emissions transition plan. So we're ahead of the game a little bit, but we'll be constrained by finances, not demands to begin this process and considerations. Transit agencies are also advised to conduct a more in-depth analysis of infrastructure and space needs at the facilities. And we're going to get to next steps very quickly. But VTrain should explore the potential for conversion kits. Those weren't part of the funding and the financing piece. But there's an operations manager in GMT who has a lot of experience in electrification projects. And Connie Engler is their operations manager. She was wondering, why couldn't some of the mix be mid-year conversions when they have a 12-year vehicle going through a 6 or 7 year midlife overhaul? During that overhaul, could they convert and use a kit to make it electric for far less than it would cost for a new electric bus? And she's also talking about en route charging with different partners. And we really have a great partner at GMT who's been part of this discussion for far longer than I, and was in California working on their efforts. But because of the battery technology is improving, but right now the larger buses have the range, VTrain should consider building out the electric bus fleet of Green Mountain Transit, the only urban agency in the state, as it waits for smaller vehicles, those cutaways, to improve enough to serve longer routes. And I agree with that because it's going to take a larger perspective and consideration to implement large-scale electrification plans. GMT in the urban area, that's where our air is least clean. It's where the routes make the most sense, and it's where they use the larger buses. That all makes a lot of sense. In addition to that, we have GMT who's looking to build a new facility in central Vermont and get out of a floodplain in a fairly dilapidated facility that VTrain still owns. We could use this opportunity to build an electric shop in an electric facility. So instead of buying 3 gas tanks, those investments go to the electrification infrastructure. As a result, I would like to immediately work with GMT to get them the funding to conduct a specific implementation plan for GMT urban and rural services. And relatedly, we are seeing that the cutaways are being tested through the FTA Altoona testing requirement, and that, yes, the salespeople are telling us they're doing great. We'll see about the final reports, but we are confident we'll have better ranges and specs soon. V-Trans, they talk about auxiliary diesel heaters. We understand that the need for that at this point. And then again, they're saying, hey, don't forget about hydrogen or wireless inductive charging. Even though I was fairly dismissive through our discussions, I want to really focus on the plugins of the electric. There may be a way forward using a lot of different partners on hydrogen. And there may be some areas where conductive charging it makes sense. And so that's really, they start talking about, well, you could use 2 electric buses instead of 1 diesel bus. That's not something that I think we need to consider for many, many years down the road as we work to switch out those 1-for-1 buses. And so wrapping up, they just have a couple other things they want to keep mind of as we proceed, which is use those telematics. That's been very helpful in the case studies. Explore charge management systems and plug and play turnkey charging programs as charging as a service. Work with those manufacturers and continue to get the training we need as we bring on different models. Right now we have Gillig and Proterras and Datco's coming in. There's a company outside of Montreal that's trying to entice us with the Latendra vehicles that look really great. And again, Connie wants to learn more. And we've already been leveraging federal funds. We're very successful in our low and no emissions grants because VEIC is really bringing together the utility, and we've got a way forward on that. And the next steps, this is the next step, is to share the initial information and publish the report at the end of this month, see what the administration thinks, the agency, prepare for the upcoming low and no emissions bus and bus facilities grant program to whatever extent I'm allowed, provide funding for GMT's fleet transition plan. I'd like to get going on that in the next few weeks. Right now, all of these procurements with those 18 electric buses are having weekly or bi-weekly or bi-monthly calls. We want to make some of those a quarterly event so that we can all see what all of these procurements are revealing in terms of challenges, opportunities, delivery dates, charging, those types of things. That will be done starting probably January, February. That will be up to some of the staff. And then we want to begin implementation with the understanding of the associated challenges, benefits, and knowing that this dynamic industry will change. We'll need to update this plan every few years, if not every 5 years. And that's the first presentation I have for you this morning.
Ross, when do you think it's going to be? I know there's free fares. You think it's ever going to change? There'll be some fares in the future, because I don't know how you can do it for no fares at all.
Yeah, and this is our next piece, right? And presentation, if I may, I'll just go right into it, Senator.
Okay, whatever.
Okay, thank you. So your concern is our concern, and there's really, a bifurcation of fares. We have the 5311 profile, those non-urban routes. We generate about $575,000 in non-federal revenues. Those dollars come off the top of a route. So if a route costs $100,000 and we get $10,000 in fares, that route then becomes $90,000, and then we apply 50-50 or 80-20 splits on the components of those routes, admin or operations. Roughly half of the rural routes were already zero fare before we went completely zero fare, because support from Dartmouth Hitchcock or some of the mountains, or some folks like RCT or GMCN were charging 50 cents and finding that it was costing about as much or costing a big percentage just to handle the overheads associated with the fare boxes and handling that cash on a daily basis. 3 to 9% fare box recovery. That's the % of operating budget on most of these routes that do have fares. The 5307 urban area is totally different. They have a more robust service. They charge fares on all of their routes now that they've gotten out of, except for the Mountain Road Shuttle, which is supported by Stowe. They have a more robust system, more service, more riders, more coverage, and they have a more of a 20 to 25% fare box recovery. For the
Ross,
yes,
I want to go back to the last slide.
yes, ma'am.
Okay, on the rural, I believe every town in, at least in Caledonia, I think in RCT's district, actually, rather than a fare box, they have towns appropriate money for the residents to use the service. So does your fare box recovery reflect those municipal appropriations that are done on behalf of their residents for this services that they are provided?
It does not. What that is, that's reflected in the local funds component of our budgets at the provider level. The budgets will show federal, state, and local funds. And
because that's one of the, reasons that towns are giving appropriations is it doesn't mean individual people have to, make the payment. It's just done as a service to town residents. So, all right, you've answered my question then. That those collective payments on behalf of residents of riders in a particular town are not reflected. This is just fare box money. Okay.
That's correct. And, as a resident of Peacham, we pay a certain amount of monies, and we expect that the elderly and disabled and the Medicaid services, are part of the transportation services that you have in Peacham. Many towns do provide funds and assistance to the local transit provider, and that's to match capital, to match operations, to match admin. And then does that allow them to be fare free? In half the instances, yes, that is the case in the rural areas. When we looked at fare free policies, when we were looking at methods to increase the use of public transit in Vermont, we stated that there would be an increase in ridership with zero fares, but that would be mostly with more trips by existing riders. There are hesitations or implications to low-income people to spend a few dollars to get to and from where they want to go. The system would be certainly easier to use. We wouldn't be buying fare boxes. We wouldn't be handling the cash. We wouldn't need security cameras in rooms and those types of things. In terms of the associated overheads. And at 10:30, I believe, I'll be participating in the CCRPC's transit financing study that does discuss the fare loss of revenues. Right now, with the loss of ridership, you have a loss of potential revenues. And if we're at 47% of pre-COVID revenues, that $575,000 received would be $270,000. The 2.2 million could be less than 1.5 million. But it's still a lot of money that supports a lot of routes and efforts, primarily in our urban system. The 5311 rural program has COVID relief funds to help us maintain zero fares throughout FY23. So the FY23 budget does call for a continuation of fare-free service. We'll continue to review budgets and consider extending zero fares on an annual basis. That's the rural side. That's the part that I'm part of in a very big way. The 5307 urban program is managed through their Board of Commissioners, and they are an authority. They're considering fares in FY23. John Moore will be part of that 10:30 discussion and can provide updates and details. But the Board of Commissioners are really, struggling to figure out, is it worth to be fare free? And if not, how would you generate those funds otherwise to cover those gaps? That's where we are with fares. I don't know if sustainability wise, we spend pre-COVID $8 million in state funds? Could we make it 7.5 in state funds and that $500,000 being used to cover fares in future years? I don't know yet. There's so many moving parts. We have the new infrastructure bill that will change a lot of our appropriations and funding. And it's too early to tell, but we are confident that we can maintain zero fares through FY23. And that's where we are for that one. And if anybody has questions on fares, let's do that now, and then I'll turn it over and kind of drive the slides for staff member Dan Courier.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Okay, Dan, are you with us?
I sure am, Ross. Thanks for having me here this morning. So I'll take over doing some of the talking so Ross can take a break. So I'm here to present on the VTrans intermodal connectivity study, which was a statewide review of the ferry, train, and bus connections in Vermont. And we worked with a consultant, actually AECOM, that Ross was just referencing, an electrification plan. This was a legislative study through the transportation bill to conduct the intermodal connection review. And we did work with our public transit, the rail, and other service providers across Vermont for the information and review that you'll see today. Next slide. And so what we have here on the right is a map of the services that were looked at. We've got, the intermodal connections with our rail, which is the Amtrak, the intercity buses, which is the Greyhound and the Vermont Trans Line. We also have all the transit agencies and their schedules that were part of the review. And then we had 28 stations that were looked at in Vermont. And those 28 of those 24 were actually assessed in much detail. In total, we did, it went through 4 steps. Ross, you're going a little fast with this. Can you back up, please? Thanks. In total, we looked at 4 components for the research, including past reports. And in 7 total reports were looked at, including the rail and intercity freight plans and the transit policy plan. We conducted surveys and interviews. And then we looked at over 890 schedules in Vermont, trying to figure out their connections. And then we conducted those 24 site assessments. Next slide. From our stakeholder engagement, we really discovered that the largest improvement that was out there was in the rail and our service improvements. And that was across the board what many people shared. Other things that we found out was that if you had strong jobs, you also needed strong intermodal and commuter rail and commuter bus services. And so the demand was high for those where you had strong and high job concentrations. We also found out that Albany really is a strong destination, and we reformatted our intercity bus, the Vermont Trans Line bus, to help serve that location actually twice a day. The Amtrak is still proving to cause some, rider concerns and low confidence. That Amtrak coming in not on time, that on-time performance is low, and so that's still creating some heartache for the riders and the users there. But we can improve the system with better connections, better communication between the operators. And so it's something, to be worked on into the future when we start to do the implementation of this. And then obviously knowledge is key, right? And unfortunately, we still have low knowledge on some of our connections in Vermont. Next slide. When we looked at the schedules, what we found was that, and when we looked at the schedules, really we're focused on wait time. How long would it take to make a connection, to another mode, whether it's intercity bus, rail, commuter bus, or local connections. And so on average, what we found that during the weekday, someone trying to make a connection would have to wait about 81 minutes on average across Vermont. And on the weekends, you had about an hour on Saturday and just over an hour on Sunday. And so, what we're finding is that basically 37% of the locations had no service on Saturday and 62% had no service on Sunday. And then of the 890 intermodal schedules that we looked at, 231, which is about that 26%, didn't have any connection at all, right? So basically, you would end up at a location and there was no connection to other modes, right? There was connection inside the network for another local route, but they didn't make a connection to another mode or another intercity connection. And some of the reasons for this really are, what you have is commuter buses that really are focused on transporting employees to employment centers, and that's really their main focus. They're not looking to connect intermodally. You also have, the Vermont Amtracker, that basically their northbound train, as well as the Vermont Transline's PM route, they are just running too late. Many, many local services are ending between 7 and 8 p.m. And those trains and those buses are all, arriving way after that time. And then, where you've got intermodal connections, they rarely, have the same bus as well as the same rail serving the same location. And so there's just no way to connect those two services together. Next slide, Ross. Each station that we looked at, and that's 24 in total, has one of these detailed site assessments conducted for it. And really, this is a great roadmap for the agency as well as the operators to kind of look at station by station. What modes are there? How many connections do we have? What are the amenities at the stations? How do we, what are, those other commuter and bus services there? And then it also talks about the wait times. What would it take to do that intermodal connection? And then we really have the list at the bottom of these of all of the concerns and opportunities that were discovered for improvements at the stations. And it's those improvements that really developed the list of recommendations that we have at each station, as well as the overarching recommendations. Next slide, Ross. Those recommendations are broken out into overarching recommendations, and those are statewide or regional wide, where we look at, what happens, for signage or what happens when you have schedules. And then you have station by station recommendations. They're looking at the capital. That's those infrastructure pieces, whether it's benches or, new waiting areas. And then service, improvements, the recommendations that we identified, whether it's, lengthening the operating day or even adding new routes that would go into that location. Next slide, Ross. And so all of those 29 recommendations were then prioritized. And the prioritization really looked at what was the impact, of that improvement to the system and improving the connection, to other intermodal, routes. How complex was that recommendation to actually, implement? Is it something as easy as a sign, or is it something as complicated as building and planning new bus routes? And then what is the cost? Is it a small cost or is it a large cost? All of that together comes up and develops our prioritization. From the prioritization, we then divided the recommendations into two pots. We have got a short-term group of recommendations and a long-term group of recommendations. And those short-term recommendations really, are things that can occur in a year or less. It's something that should be very easy, like putting up new signage where existing signage is. And long-term recommendations were then further divided into low, medium, and high priorities. And that was based on the prioritization that we used above. Ross, next slide. And so the next 4 slides are all the recommendations, all those 29 recommendations broken out into their 2 groups. We have the short-term recommendations first. There was 9 recommendations in total that fall into the short-term recommendations. And each of these tables has the description of the recommendation, those categories that it fell into, that type category. So again, that's the station capital, the station service, or the overarching recommendation for the statewide level. And then how many stops did this particular recommendation apply to? So some examples, as you see here, as I talked before, some of the short-term recommendations are like replace the existing signs or actually put up signs, where there is none. And then you've got, information like, oh, can we improve the communication about the transit app in Vermont, which is a real-time bus tracking application that any rider can use to understand where the buses are and how soon they'll be arriving. Next slide, Ross. For the long-term recommendations, again, we have high, medium, and low priority. In the high priority, there were 4 recommendations that fell into this category, including putting signage where there was no signage. And a lot of this is, where, we'd have to work with the local communities or, with the actual operators to put in new signs where signs had never existed before. And then we're talking about improving connections too on the weekdays and the weekends. Next slide. And then for the medium priority long-term recommendations, this is a lot of capital and a lot of service, right? Where we can put in new seating or improve waiting area infrastructure, where we can, reduce the redundancy in our schedules or even add new midday service or weekend service to a location. And then we've got the low priority ones. And these are the ones that are going to cost the most, are the most difficult to implement, right? They certainly are something to plan for, but we should just need to recognize that these are going to be more difficult than the others. And a lot of these are like, some really cool amenities, like installing real-time arrival information at our, major station locations, right? Expanding the Amtrak and intercity station hours, right? Right now, those station hours, they're only operated about 15 minutes a day, 15 minutes before the train and 15 minutes after the train, right? What would it look like to have those stations staffed for 4 hours, 8 hours, or whatever? And then really, offer a coordinated passenger and ticketing system across Vermont. So if you got on the Amtrak, you could then transfer to Greyhound, you could then transfer to your local bus service, all with the same pass. That doesn't exist today, right? But it's a future thing that we, certainly should look to. And it's something, that's technology that VTrans is certainly interested in doing. We've done leaps and bounds, with a lot of our technical models that we've been following. Next slide. And this is really the next step for this report, and so the report is drafted. It's been shared with operators, regional planning commissions, internally in VTrans, all trying to get a review. Welcome to share it with this committee if you'd like to see it as well. Really what we're looking for is to review those, and really to come up with the final prioritization with the operators and taking those 24 stations and those, overarching recommendations and trying to look at them, and in the next year, and that's fiscal year 23, what can we implement, right? What's the timeline for those? And then start planning for the long-term recommendations, because many of those will take 2-3 years to implement. And so if not further, and so really just try to put this through an implementation process and take those 29 recommendations and try to really do what's in the nature, of the legislative directive, to help improve the connectivity of those intermodal connections. And that's my presentation. Any questions?
Everyone, Senator Mazza. You're muted, Senator Mazza, but I'm going to assume you recognize me. Good to see you, Dan. Great presentation. A couple of comments. You mentioned system knowledge is low, and I love that you recognize that, especially when it comes to rail and connecting to public transit, busing, and so on. I got to say, until I became a senator, I didn't know that there was a train that left St. Albans and went all the way down to Washington, D.C. every single day, except when it was off the line for the pandemic. And I'm really excited about the new train service that's going to be out of Burlington straight through Rutland all the way down. Can you speak more about how we are more broadly expanding awareness of train service to get to the major cities here in Vermont? And in that same vein, I'd love for you, I don't mean to be provincial in my advocacy here, but I'm really excited about the Essex connector and how that can really change the Essex Junction facility. And I'm hoping that there's some intermodal planning to make sure GMT is going to have the right routes to serve, to make sure that when those trains come into Essex Junction, that they can get down to the Burlington train station or to Burlington International Airport, so that there's a lot of cohesion across air, train, and busing as that Essex connector comes online to expand and improve a train service to Essex Junction. Any thoughts on how we can promote more broadly the expanded?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I'll put on my Go Vermont. I'm also the Go Vermont manager. In that program, I basically try to promote all modes in Vermont: public transit, rail. And that is one means to highlight these connections. And so we already have an existing site for that, highlighting the Amtrak service. And so that is one means that will certainly include that Ethan Allen, expansion out of Burlington. And so, but the rail section, is a great partner with us, and I'll have to, reach out to them and find out what their plans are. I don't know, what their direction will be. They'll work with Amtrak closely, on engagement. And I know GMT, the station assessments did not include that new route, nor did it include the new service, that will be there for the rail. So that's going to be something to update in these stations with GMT once that new service comes online. And so, yeah.
Yes, Jane.
I just wanted to ask, one of the issues that becomes or challenges is parking. Whether we're talking about where you pick up the bus, you see this all the time at Dartmouth Coach. Originally, it was free parking, and there was plenty of parking. And now, even with the bigger lot, now they're changing. On the other hand, the state of New Hampshire has free parking in Concord, for example, and in I believe Salem or Rockingham as they head into Boston. And it seems like the adequacy we're seeing. The need for parking and adequacy of parking as a real issue. And I'm just wondering, as we're looking at trying to make connections work better, and we're hoping to get greater take up of our rail system, which seems so promising. What are you thinking about in terms of addressing the parking need? Because people have either got to have somebody take them to get on that first leg of public transit, or they've got to park somewhere. And we're seeing that and even in New Hampshire, you see it parking for their trailheads, and we're seeing it for the Moyle Valley Rail Trail. So I just wondered how that is being factored in long-term planning.
Sure. I'll mention one small thing that the report yielded, and then Ross, if you have any thoughts as well. But one thing that we really talked about was this idea of wayfinding and trying to put up, additional information, not only for the people that get off the train, but for the people trying to get to the train. Really understand where the train station is, how do you get there, on the roads, but the parking locations for sure in the community that you're trying to get to. We've got, some. Certainly, in the downtowns, parking is at a commodity, right? But we've got lots of park and rides in Vermont, and those park and rides are mostly served by the transit routes. I would have to think that we could build, those connections where we go from where we've got good parking available and adjacent to, our interstates and our intermodal connections, generate the wayfinding that's needed for someone to then successfully navigate those trips, park their car safely and for zero or no, for a low or no cost for the day or for the week, and then go to the train station, or he'll hop on the bus that would then bring them to the train station. So I think we're really talking about bringing together, a bunch of the network that exists in Vermont already to try to, address some of that parking concerns.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Senator Perchik.
Yeah, hi Dan, or maybe Ross. You mentioned the delays that the Vermonter has been experiencing, and do you have something to say about why the delays are? or what they are? Do you know what's
I
causing?
personally don't, and I did not. All I know is that it comes in later, or the schedule is unpredictable, so that on-time performance, so say you read the schedule and it says it's going to come in at 8
Right.
and it comes in late, more times than not, is what I've been told. But Ross, what have you been around
Sure.
longer?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Dan. And just for everybody's knowledge, Dan is the Vermont program manager, our IT person, our data person, and a public transit coordinator, and just so fortunate to have him. But for us, we would have to look at the rail on-time performance information they're getting. I know that we received a lot of this data as anecdotal through surveys, and there could be a perception that the train's not on time, but in many instances, we should defer to the rail section to talk about their services. I don't have that information either. To back up a little bit to Senator Chittenden's comments, everyone in Vermont, in VTrans is aware of the new services coming online, GMT not least of whom are part of the planning process. And there's corridor studies that I've been invited to that include GMT. We'll continue to work with them. And every year, applications that come in speak to adjustments necessary because of new built environments, new services, new intermodal connections coming online. We'll stand at the ready to augment or complement those new services as best we can.
Any questions? Any further questions?
If I may just follow up on that point, Senator Mosley.
Go right ahead.
So does the state, have we historically, or do other states play a promotional role for rail service in the state? Is that something that we do? Because I've never seen an advertisement, but maybe I'm just not in the right media channels, that we have a Vermonter. And I took it this summer. It was great. It was a great experience. It was really cheap. I got to say the coffee was not good. But other than that, the training was a great experience. And when I was telling my friends about taking the train down to Philadelphia, the same train out of St. Albans, they had no idea about it. So what do we do and what have we done? Is this something we're looking at doing, lining up with the new train service out of Burlington?
Sure. Amtrak works with our rail program and the chief marketing officer over at ACCD to coordinate, their outreach program. Dan, as GoVermont program manager, is responsible to help promote all modes. We focused on carpools and vanpools and transit mostly in the past. But with these rail changes and the evolution of rail services, we can, complement those efforts and become part of that service. I've seen advertisements for Amtrak in magazines and a couple banner ads, but if we can do a better job. We spend maybe $60,000 to $80,000 in media buys every year. In the next couple of years, a portion of that will go toward promoting the Amtrak service. Certainly, concurrent to that, we need to use those station assessments with each of our providers and really get working on a 1 to 5 year plan of how we can better incorporate these intermodal connections. And that's where we are today. We have a really great document to get started with for every one of these stations. And we hope that those applications for FY23 will address some of those low-hanging fruit and work with the RPCs to get started on some of those larger projects that would take a few years to get done and finance.
Very good overview this morning. And maybe we'll have you back at some time, but it's very informative and I appreciate it. Any other questions before we take our break? Well, thank you again, and we'll see you in a little while here, I guess, again.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator.
Appreciate it.
Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, Jeannie, you can take us off.